Hey everyone, Chris Knott with Reprogrammed here. And today I'm going to be talking about mobility, especially as I get to my clients that are getting older, even late 30s, 40s, and beyond. Mobility becomes an issue. Everyone's talking about being stiff and tight all the time. Even going back down to athletics, we need to be able to move. So there's a lot of content and there's a lot of stuff coming out on mobility training. However, there's a few misnomers that I want to address first so that you really understand what goes into mobility. All right, first and foremost, what is mobility? It's just the ability to move around a joint, okay? My arm, shoulder has the greatest mobility around a joint, which means it also has the least amount of stability. My hip being deeper, there's a lot of motion at the hip, but because of the design of the hip socket, again, a lot of mobility, but there's a little bit more stability. Now, take that into like the elbow. There's only one range of motion at the elbow. So again, less mobility because I can't twist my arm this way. I can't, again, rotation comes from other bones. And so there's a lot more stability. So the less range of motion, the more stability, the more range of motion, and therefore the less stability, which means that I have to get my muscles working correctly in synergy to be able to supply that stability. So go back to the shoulder, for example. When I was a sophomore in high school, I completely dislocated my shoulder on my pitching arm. And when all the doctors said I needed to have surgery because I tore my rotator cuff, tore the labrum, when it dislocated, it put a chunk in the head of the humerus. And they said, we got to tighten all that up. Why? Because again, I had no stability. I would literally fall asleep and then it would dislocate again in the middle of the night. And so they wanted to tighten everything up to create that stability. Well, I was a baseball player and common sense said, if I lose my range of motion, am I going to be able to pitch again? Which the answer was not very effectively. So therefore that surgery made no sense to me. And so even as a sophomore in high school, I was already questioning our current orthopedic practices. And then when you tell a doctor who is their only job is to do surgery and you say, I don't want to do surgery, what do they say? Go do physical therapy. So the next thing you know, you're doing this dumb band exercise, wondering why your shoulder's not getting better. Well, again, this is before internet, before understanding anything. I didn't even know what a rotator cuff was as a sophomore in high school. So I went to the library, I started reading anatomy books, and I started looking up things, found out the rotator cuff is these 4 small muscles that work towards stability. And I'm like, wait, those 4 small muscles should be responsible for decelerating at the time as a sophomore in high school, I was already throwing like low 80s. And I'm like, okay, my arm is moving at 80 some miles per hour and those 4 muscles are supposed to be responsible for the stability. Well, that didn't make a lot of sense. So I started looking, what is that attached to? Well, it's attached to the scapula. I started having a winged out scapula, and kind of before that, it was because when I entered high school, I was the same height I'm in now, but I was sopping wet, maybe 140 pounds. I could barely bench press 95 pounds. So I was fast, skinny, and weak. And so what do my football coaches want to do? Bigger, faster, stronger, right? And what does every kid want to do in high school that has no good coaching? Well, let's go and bench press a ton. So I went from a 95-pound bench press as a freshman all the way to a 225-pound bench press by the time I was a sophomore. And guess what? I was the guy that was starting to walk around like this. So my mobility went to here. I lost range of motion. And then when I went to throw in baseball, these muscles contracted, and ultimately that's how I dislocated the shoulder. So bottom line is that this little rotator cuff exercise with the band, and a little side note, there's no such thing as isolating a muscle. No muscle, even if I do a bicep curl, I don't just use the bicep. There's the brachioradialis, I'm using my forearm, I'm using all sorts of muscles to create stability and to create movement. So anyone that says we're gonna isolate a muscle, they're already an idiot. Let's not listen to them. However, going back to my shoulder, when I started looking at the anatomy as a whole, well, what's connected to the scapula that seems to be the anchor to the rotator cuff? Let me look on some muscle balancing. Let me work on my serratus. Let me work on opening my chest that was like this. How do I do that? Well, I got to rebalance the muscles in the posterior side. When I did all of that work, and I started to, in essence, I didn't even know what I was doing, but I was creating my own physical therapy programs as a sophomore in high school. That's how I was able to start throwing again my junior year, back to pitching as a senior, back to walking on at Purdue as a freshman in college. So I was able to do all of that without surgery. I'm almost 48 years old now, and I have still not had any shoulder surgeries. And yet I've dislocated shoulders. I've been jacked around from wrestling to jujitsu to just all the stupid falls that I've taken, from snowboarding to martial arts to whatever. I've beat them up pretty good. And yet, full range of motion. I can go out right now, throw a baseball as hard as I want to. It doesn't matter, because the muscles are doing their job. So that brings me kind of a long story back to the main point, which is, when you were a kid, did you stretch before going out and playing at recess? No, the answer is no. You literally were at a desk. When the bell rang, you got up, probably sprinted out because you were so excited to get out of the classroom. And the next thing you know, we were jumping off of swings. We were jumping off the playground equipment. If you had trees and fences, we were doing that. And not once did you think, oh, I should do this warm up and I should do all this stretching, or else I'm going to blow out my ACL, or I'm going to tweak my back. No, as a little kid, you jumped off of all sorts of things without even thinking about it. Now, if I take one of my NFL guys and I said, hey, guess what? Let me put you on this thing about 5 feet high. I want you just to jump down for me. I want to see the quality of your landing. They'd be like, oh, no way. I'm going to blow out my knee. I can't do that. And yet we call these guys professional athletes. This is what I've said in previous videos. Just because someone is getting paid lots of money to do a skill doesn't mean that they're necessarily a professional athlete. An athlete is someone that is professional at utilizing their body in all environments the way the human was designed. But just because you can shoot a free throw or swing a golf club or do whatever, catch a football, doesn't necessarily make you a professional when it comes to human design and the ability to use your body. So I always go back to that. And my job with most of my NFL guys or other professional athletes is I have to take them back in time and regain what we lost when we were little kids. So my training is, it's like being in a time machine. That's what I want to do. And that's also the message for longevity. So when I work with guys like Von Miller, and I started him 10 years ago, the goal was, and now his goal is he wants his 2 little boys to have memories of him playing in the NFL. So what does that mean? He has to stay healthy to be able to produce year after year and have longevity. How do you maintain longevity and health for a lifetime? You stay healthy by going back to your human design, because we're meant to do this. We're not meant to be sitting around 8 hours a day, or what we do to little kids, sit them in classrooms all day, then they tighten up. Then what kids don't have is absolute strength. So even though that kid in its design, before a whole bunch of compensations and injuries and whatnot, they don't have absolute strength, meaning they're not going to just bench press 350 pounds. They're not going to run at 22 miles per hour. That comes from producing more force. So what do? We throw kids in weight training, junior high, high school, but they don't get good weight training. It's a lot of the same old, bench squat, deadlift with horrible form. And it's what happened to me. And this is why I want to give you all this knowledge, and I'm very passionate about it, is because it really came from my childhood injuries that plagued me throughout my college sports, which then led me to being the athlete or the trainer of athletes. But I had to go back to rehab myself and rehab so many athletes that were struggling with these injuries. All right, so let me bring this all back home. When you were born, your muscles were in essence, perfect, relative balance. And therefore, little babies, you can put their feet over their head, they just giggle at you. You could jump off of the playground equipment when you were in elementary school. You didn't worry about hurting yourself. So when it's time to get that absolute strength, we just need to maintain what we actually have with the muscle balance and the neural programming, because it's a lot about motor patterning. And just know that once we start to get in sports, and we have another issue, which is kids who are in the one sport now year round. It's club this, club that, as opposed to, again, when I grew up, we played every sport. We did everything. And that is actually a detriment of what we're doing to our kids now, that now, unfortunately, we have to fix. So if this is resonating to you, and you're now in your late 30s and you've been sitting at a desk for a while, you've been getting stiff because you got out of sports in maybe high school or college, but yet you still want to be athletic, you still want to have the longevity, let me tell you, the solution is not going out and doing this stretch. It's not going out and doing elaborate warm-ups. The solution is going back to our natural God-given design, getting the motor programming back, overcoming compensations, overcoming strength imbalances, so that all the muscles are doing their job effectively, so that you have both stability at the joint and the ability to produce and absorb force. Because if I have to go and cut, when I hit the ground, I have to absorb that force. I have to be stable, and I have to be able to transfer that force and now produce force in the direction that I need to go. And to do that, the muscles have to respond correctly, which is a motor pattern issue, without guarding and compensation. They have to have enough absolute strength to handle the load, because again, when you're a little kid, if you weigh 50 pounds and you drop down 6 feet, there's gonna be X amount of force, which is still a lot. But if I weigh 200 pounds for that same drop, there's obviously more force. So we have to grow in force production. And I have to do it at velocity, which is another problem in traditional training. When people go to the gym, everything usually is pretty controlled, and we want it to be that way, and that's great for absolute strength. However, when I have to cut really fast, things happen in less than 0.2 seconds. My body has to elongate like a rubber band stretching and be able to do that incredibly fast. And if it doesn't respond, that's how we see guys like big, strong guys just whoop, they slip off the curb, boom, and there goes out a knee. And it's because their muscles did not do the right task in that short amount of time, because they did not know how to fire at velocity, and the wrong action occurred, which allowed that force to go into the joint where it was never meant to go, and that's where we get our damage. So if you stuck with me through this, you can hopefully understand that when I go and I do traditional warm-ups or I do static stretching, I'm not treating the problem of your lack of mobility. I'm just treating the symptom, which is why if you're in this routine of warm-up, stretch, guess what? You're doing it again tomorrow, then the next day. Once you're done, within 20 minutes of cooling off, your back gets tight, your hamstrings are tight, your knees are sore. All this stuff is happening because you're not treating the problem. So let me give you a few tools today on some of the strength imbalances and some of the common mishaps that we see in the gym, so that you can at least incorporate some of these things. Now, if you really want the more advanced stuff, that's where I get into my neuro training, because now we're working with the nervous system, we're working with the brain and the nervous system as it pertains to compensation, where the body wants to guard and protect from false movement patterns, from imbalances, from previous injuries. If you sprained your ankle 5 years ago and you quote unquote rehabbed it because the body went through its healing process, that doesn't mean that you still don't have compensations. Your brain remembers. So now when you're running and you maybe make that one cut, your brain goes, hey, remember last time bad things happened? Guess what? It's fearful. So the muscles tense up, bam, and there it goes again. So that's why we constantly hear people, oh, I never sprained my ankle until the first time I sprained my ankle. And then every time after that, they're spraining their ankle over and over and over, because the physical body will heal, but it doesn't always heal perfectly because we have scar tissue, we have other things, and that's a whole other lesson. But even so, even if I could perfectly heal the physical attributes of my anatomy, if the motor pattern is off, I still have problems, I still have compensation. So at the very least, I'm not getting out of my body what it can do, and at worst, you're susceptible to more injuries. So with that said, one of the starting points that you can start to implement today is appropriate strength. Again, if you're bench pressing all the time, like I was from my freshman to sophomore year, you're gonna have an imbalance and you're gonna see guys that walk around like this. That is immediately gonna create problems at the shoulder joint and therefore make you susceptible to injury and at the very least, mobility. I was just rehabbing a guy yesterday who was talking about he couldn't put his hand behind his back correctly, and he was thinking it was a shoulder problem. Well, guess what? It wasn't in the shoulder. The problem was that from the side, when his shoulder's pulled forward, guess what? I can't get my hand back here. Watch what happens when my shoulder comes back. Oh, guess what? Now my hand goes back here. So just by having muscle balance can get you a long way when it comes to mobility. So we're gonna train this with the right exercises to work on the deficits that I see in the 80-20 rule. 80% of the population has all these same deficits. We're gonna teach you how to do it under control because we still wanna get some motor pattern control, and then you'll be on your way, at least at a foundational level, of regaining your mobility. This exercise we call the rear leg elevated iso lunge. Now, let me break this one down a little bit because it's one of my staple exercises in almost all my programs, whether we're talking rehab or high-level sports performance, because the first thing that we have to do on both is really work on muscular balance and proper motor patterning. The reason being is that when we have a compensation, we have a deficit, I can't get out of my muscles what they need to. And in human movement, it's not just a shortening. We have to be able to extend and lengthen to absorb force, typically before we have to then contract and generate force. So the rear leg iso lunge is a great way to work on hip mobility as well as hip stability. And again, you're gonna hear me say those two words interchangeably. And we're gonna start working on some of the weaknesses from sitting all the time, from using our quads all the time and not really having good glute activation or hamstring development. So the next concept when it comes to what we call our isos, it's not a true iso. An isometric is this, right? I've got force, but there's no lengthening or shortening of the muscle. However, if I were to press here, but then this muscle is starting to pull ever so slow, now it's lengthening and it's absorbing the force. And that's the concept I want to teach you here. When I have to, let's say, jump and land, a muscle is lengthening to absorb that force. But to do that effectively so it doesn't stop to resist the ground, which then would tighten the muscle and pull on the joints, which is where we get our knee and hip pain, what we want to do is actually activate the opposing muscles, meaning the hamstrings and glutes, so that the quad muscle can lengthen under the load. And that way it's an active lengthening, and the primary muscles become the opposites, the ones that are actually pulling the joints into position. And so that's where the motor pattern comes in, but it's a different mindset compared to how most people train. And we could apply this to anything. If I'm bench pressing and I'm lowering the weight, instead of resisting the bar, if I'm resisting the bar on the way down, I'm telling this muscle to tense up, tense up, tense up, but because the joint is opening, that muscle is being forced to lengthen, and it's like playing tug of war, and that's where we get pain. As opposed to, as the bar is coming down in a bench press, if I pull with my back, I can pull, and as I pull, this opens, but it's an active lengthening so that that force can be absorbed correctly. The joint opens and the force stays in the muscle and it doesn't tighten up and go into the joint, which causes pain. So this is it's really a high level concept, but it's what you do as a kid naturally that we now have to go back in time to relearn. So let's get into the rear leg elevated iso lunge. Okay, for the rear leg elevated iso lunge, we just need something that I can elevate my foot on. I really love these kind of stands, but if you had a chair, if you had a bench, it all works the same as long as it's high enough that my knee isn't hitting the ground. So I'm gonna bring up one leg and I'm gonna put it on the roller here. I'm gonna hop out so that my shin is at vertical. Now there's a time where I want my foot back and have a knee forward if I really do wanna focus a little bit more on the quad. However, for most people, the quads are already being overutilized and we have to get into the hamstring and glute, which means I want that vertical shin. So when I hop out, what you're gonna see is I'm going to pull myself into position utilizing my hamstring, which again, if I am bending my knee and going down, that's a leg curl, meaning I should be using my hamstring. If I am resisting the ground, I'm actually using my quad, which is a leg extension. However, if I'm doing a leg extension but my knee's bending, that's where we get the tug of war. So all together, foot comes up, I'm gonna hop out, pull into position. Again, I have a vertical shin. Now, this back leg, watch. Most people make the mistake of pressing down like I'm doing this leg extension back here, which tightens my quad and tightens my hip. That's what I don't want. Again, if the knee is bending, I need to be doing that leg curl. So imagine if I'm actually curling my heel towards my butt. So as I pull down here, I'm also pulling here and I'm driving this knee back from the glute. So as I get in this position, this opposite glute is what's holding me up, because again, that's the extension, but I'm pulling down, which pulls the hip down. The shin stays vertical, so you're not seeing any motion here. This back knee, again, I'm pressing. So the way I like to teach this, imagine if my legs are scissors. As I come down, this opens this scissor, but as this knee goes back, I'm opening this scissor. So again, the scissors are opening, 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 which is creating my hip length. Again, there's my quote unquote stretch, but notice, again, I'm not passively stretching. This is an active lengthening. Glute active, hamstring is active, front hamstring, front glute, quad. Notice, for the most part, it's pretty relaxed. This one, again, it's not active. I'm not pressing down. The only thing that's holding me is my toes. And then this gets to stretch, okay? I will feel a stretch, especially if you're tight, but again, it's an active stretch, not a passive stretch. That's the key. Now, I'm not getting down here and then holding myself. I'm gonna continue to pull, pull, lengthen. Because my muscles are now at their lengthened position, there's not a lot of motion. That's why we call it the ISO, because it looks like an ISO, but we call it an ISO extreme because I'm still going. Just the time of being here and talking, notice my hip is now dropping below my knee. This knee is pushing back even more, and I'm getting more and more range of motion. This is our rear leg elevated ISO lunge. The first goal is, can you get in this position? Arms down, no, nothing here, right? Arms are here. I'm gonna pull, pull, pull. Can I be here and continue to pull actively for 1 minute? Once you can do that, now we can actually build up the repetitions up to 5 1 minutes. And then the final is, can you do it for 5 minutes straight? Once you do that, now you're with one of my elite athletes. Next, I'm gonna come back to our ISO extreme push-up. Now, I spent more time talking about this one in my whole bench press series. So if you wanna reference that, I go into way more detail on that. But I do wanna hit this in terms of our discussion on mobility, because for people who need more shoulder mobility, part of it is we need to open up the tightness that we get all the time in the chest, in the neck, and everything that's drawing us forward. So the ISO push-up is a great way to do that. So what we're gonna do is, I like to use my parallettes. However, boxes work, anything that elevates you off the ground so we can get into a good deep push-up position. Now again, this is one of our ISO extremes, which means I'm not holding a position and resisting, which then tightens the muscle. The entire time, I'm going to pull from my back. As I pull, 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 this opens deeper and deeper and deeper. And as I continue to pull over time, again, with our ISO extremes, our first goal is always 1 minute of work. Then we build up to 5 1 minutes, and then eventually a 5 minute full ISO extreme. And if you're able to actively pull into position the entire time, you are getting yourself into deeper and deeper ranges of motion, which is where your mobility comes from. On top of that, the time duration is what allows you and allows your brain to understand the motor patterning of what's happening so that you can absorb force correctly. So here is our ISO push-up. Again, I'm gonna get into my push-up position. Just like my plank video, right? I'm gonna talk about pelvic position, so I'm not sagging doing the banana. But again, we're gonna tuck here, shoulders come back and down, and now I'm going to activate by pulling into position. Again, my head is not wafering, it's not down here, so my head is neutral, shoulders back and down, and now watch. Pull, 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 pull. My forearms should be vertical, pull, 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 pull. Now there's a point where I don't have much more range of motion, but I'm gonna actively continue to pull, and as my muscles learn over time, see how I can still continue to pull, continue to pull, continue to pull, shoulders down, pull, pull, make sure my pelvis, make sure my head, pull, pull, and last but not least, you gotta breathe. Can't hold your breath. Breathe to relax, actively pull, learn to lengthen. At the very end, don't bring the shoulders forward. Again, drive correctly through the lats, the chest, and the triceps, which again, go back to my bench press tutorial to learn how to do that effectively. Now, one of the exercises that I love to do with my athletes is what I call Waterball Flys. This right here is what I call a water ball. They're kind of hard to find, but bottom line is it's a little plyometric kind of ball, and I have a little bit of water, so when it sloshes, it gives me a little bit of an oscillatory feel. Now, this would be the ideal. However, you can do the same thing with like literally a 1 or 2 pound dumbbell. Once you see the motion, you'll understand at least the concept, but we're using this rapid fire oscillation to really create stability within the shoulder. This is something I like to do in antithesis to my ISO extreme push-up, because the ISO extreme push-up gets the motor pattern of firing the back muscles and opening the chest, but now we gotta create some strength and stability in the posterior part of the shoulder. So what I'm gonna do here is I'm just gonna hold these like such. Again, if I don't have these, I'm just gonna grab, now again, these probably only weigh about 4 to 5 pounds. So, and this is more advanced. So you might only start with like literally a 1 to 2 pound dumbbell. That's okay. We're gonna get into our prone position. So as I lie down, arms are straight, and then I am going to bounce. So when I bounce, I'm gonna hit and rebound because the idea is this pulling up motion, that's what's gonna strengthen the backs of my shoulders. But I need to do it in a ballistic way because a lot of our shoulder motion is ballistic. So here's what it looks like. Bounce, bounce. Now as I do that, you can see it's tiring, and my first goal is like 30 seconds. When your arms get tired and we don't have the strength to open up, this tightens up, and guess what? You can't get your hands off the ground. But if I can maintain that, I'm going through that full arc range of motion, and that full arc, I'm pulling back, but again, my muscles have to turn on and off quickly. Again, think of a boxer. I don't throw a punch and then just leave my arm out here. I punch, and then it rebounds, because if I want to punch again, it's got to be ready. So that is that rapid fire ballistic. This is an example of an upper body plyometric, and most people when they think of plyometrics, they just think about their legs. So here's an example of a shoulder upper body plyometric that works range of motion, works posterior strength and stability. But again, why stability? Because we're getting the muscles to fire correctly in synergy with all the other muscles, which gives you what? Mobility. This next exercise I'm going to talk about is what I call the seated good morning. A lot of people have tight hips, and you have already seen my videos on the rear leg elevated iso lunge, and that really kind of opens up the front of the hip, and mostly because of the glute activation. Now we actually need to open up the hip from a different angle, and that's why I really like this exercise. If you even know what a good morning is, most people do it as a primary back glute type of exercise, but the seated variation is what really allows me to pancake into the hips and to create a good opening. This one's fantastic for those of you that have a lot of low back tightness, but what you're gonna find is that the difficulty is actually keeping the back straight. So you might not have the range of motion that I'm gonna show you at first, but here's the key. Always work actively in the range of motion that you have correctly, go to that end point, hold it for a few seconds so your muscles start to get used to that position, and as you do it more repetition over time, you'll find yourself being able to use the active muscles to pull yourself into greater ranges of motion, just like any of our other iso extremes. So here is the seated good morning. You can really use any bar. I've just got a basic 4-inch cambered bar here. Honestly, my preference is when you use like a yoke bar because it's going to sit higher and actually create a longer lever as we sit forward. If I have a bar that sits lower on my back, that's okay. I just might have to use more weight because it's a shorter lever compared to the fulcrum, which is really my hip joint. Okay, so if I start with the barbell on my back, just like our squat form, so again, if you haven't seen my squat video on how to lock in your lats, make sure you go back and watch that. From here, again, I'm going to pull the bar down with my lats, which is going to lock in my thoracic spine so I'm not hunching over this way. Once I get my lats locked in, I'm going to open up my knees as much as you can. Obviously, if I can go further, great. If you don't have a lot of mobility yet with that, just go to as much as you can, and we're going to keep roughly a vertical shin. You can actually come out a little bit further, that's okay. The knee doesn't mean that much, except the straighter the legs go, the more hamstring, and the hamstrings do pull on the pelvis. So if you find the hamstrings being really tight, bend your legs more. If you have more hamstring flexibility, go ahead and get your legs a little straighter, and you can work that as well. Now, here's the key. I am actually going to go into an anterior pelvic tilt, meaning I'm going to try to arch my low back as much as I can. So my upper back is tight, my low back is tight, and now I'm going to pancake and fold forward. Now, you get to the point where your hamstrings and your hips are going to be the limiting point. If that's it, I'm going to hold here for 3 to 5 seconds. And then to come up, I'm going to squeeze my butt almost like an RDL or any kind of hip extension. I don't need to come back here because I'm going to lose tension. So I always keep a slight forward posture, and then I go into my next rep right here. Stretch, stretch, stretch. Again, this is active. Squeeze my butt to come out of it, right into my next rep, and squeeze. Notice how much lower I can get. And then I continue. And then again, I should be able to open up my legs even more, come down to the point where now I'm pancaked all the way onto the bench here. And then I'll typically do sets about 10, but this is a great one to actually get stronger in this position because I can add weight to the bar. If I can do 10 good reps with full range of motion, start to add weight, and now we're getting strengthened in our lengthened or weakest positions. This is our seated good morning. So in terms of mobility at the hip joint, we've gone over the rear leg elevated iso lunge. We've done the seated good morning. We've done a seated pancake with the cable machine. And now we're going to get into some of the rotational factors, which goes into both the hip as well as the low back. Now, another one of my favorites that you can reference is in my kettlebell series, when we did the bonus material for the adductor with the kettlebell. That one's, again, fantastic for both shoulder strength and mobility with the stability, and of course, the adductor, which then goes into the hip. Now, as we add in rotation, why is rotation important? A lot of our gym exercises tend to be in the sagittal plane this direction or in the frontal plane this direction, but we don't get a lot of rotation in a lot of motions in the traditional gym. However, in most sports applications in human motion, when I run, when I swing, when I throw, we're always doing rotational patterns. So we need to train them and make sure that my rotation at the low back is also a factor. So one of my ways that I like to strengthen rotation is with the mace. So a mace right here is basically like anything we can swing. Other tools, if you don't have one of these, sledgehammer, or literally a barbell, because I can change the length. Obviously, if I go out to a long barbell, if this is my barbell, that's gonna be a lot more compared to if I hold it on right here. So you can do this on a number of different apparatuses, but let me show you the exercise. Okay, so for the mace rotation, I'm gonna always grab on the end, and as a good starting point, I like to be in the middle, which again is trying to draw me down this way. Once I have my position, I'm gonna get my feet about shoulder width apart. I'm gonna do a normal, like an RDL hip hinge to try to get my back as flat to the ground as possible. Now from here, as you can see, the weight is trying to bring me down, so it's actually rotating me this way, which means just to hold it, I'm already doing a anti-rotation strengthening on one side of the oblique and my hip, my glutes, all sorts of things going on with my pelvis. From here though, I'm actually going to keep my arms straight and I'm going to rotate, bringing it straight up, and then I come down and I stop here. Because again, as I come down, this is trying to bring me through. So I'm gonna control it here, rotate, hold, slow, rotate, and here. That is my rotation. But the difference of just like, let's say grabbing a cable machine and doing rotations this way, I'm getting rotation, but how it lengthens the hamstrings, how we're stretching through the hips, we're stabilizing the adductors, the glute med, we're getting a whole bunch of other things going on with the obliques. It's just a fantastic exercise, and you get some trunk, shoulder, all sorts of good stuff. That's why I like to show you this, because it's not common that you see in most gyms. This next exercise that I'm gonna go over is what I call the seated pancake. So I'm gonna sit down flat on the ground with my legs straight. Again, based on your hamstring and adductor flexibility, we're going to determine how wide your legs are and how straight they're gonna be. Ideally, we wanna get them fully straight because I can already start off with a backwards lean on this exercise. But again, the wider I can go, the better, but that is, again, determined by where your current level is at. I'm gonna sit in front of a cable machine. I'm gonna have the cable roughly shoulder height to where I'm seated, and I like to use just a basic tricep rope. Now, from this position here, you know, weight-wise, it needs to be enough where it can be a good counterbalance, but it's not so much that you couldn't do, let's say, a good maybe 10 reps of what I'm gonna show you. From this position here, we're gonna first start off with a straight back, which means just like my seated good morning video, so if you haven't seen that yet, make sure you look at the seated good morning. We're going to actually go into a lat locked for my thoracic spine and a anterior pelvic tilt, meaning I'm gonna tighten my low back. Because now, as the weight pulls me forward, notice I'm not pulling here, I'm just letting my arms relax, but not my shoulders. That's why the lats have to be locked in. I'm gonna let the weight pull me forward, pull me forward, pull me forward, into my stretch position, and I'm only gonna go as far as I can without my low back doing that. That's the key. I just let it pull me forward. I wanna pretend my spine is a 2x4. This is where you're gonna get the most amount of hamstring stretch, as well as we're actually gonna get the small muscles in the hip and the low back. If I allow myself to round, that's gonna be different. That's gonna now go towards my shoulders and my thoracic spine. I'll still get some hamstring stretch, but to be honest, this here, rounding, means nothing more as it pertains to the hamstring, because the hamstring has to lengthen in this position relative to the hip, because the hip bones is what the hamstring attaches to. So if the hip stops moving, guess what? The hamstrings stop lengthening in this position. So I want to lock it out, because as I go into that anterior pelvic tilt, that is what pulls on my hamstrings, and I have to maintain that. So that's all we need in this position. So we're gonna hold, 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 squeeze my butt just to bring tension off, go back into it again, a little bit further, hold, 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 and squeeze the glutes. And again, I never let my lats go, never let my back go. Now at the very end, if you want to scoot back and you do want to kind of go into a deeper lengthening and work on your breathing, again, there's nothing wrong with that. It's just understand the applications. I want to teach you biomechanics of how the human body is designed. And if the goal is to open the hamstrings, the hips, and the low back, we want to maintain that anterior pelvic tilt as I come into this position. If I lose it, it actually takes tension off. Just because you get more range of motion doesn't mean you're working better. It just means you're working differently. And so if the goal again is hamstrings, pelvis, low back, maintain, 2x4, hold, breathe, exhale. Every time you exhale, you might be able to go a little bit further. Come out of it after a good 5 seconds, back into it, find it. But again, what's the point of this? I'm not static stretching. I am under load, and therefore I'm also strengthening in the lengthened position. And this is one of the keys when it comes to actual mobility and stability when it comes to human motion. All right, one more little nugget for you today when it comes to shoulder mobility. When it comes to the shoulder, it's always pretty much going to be working more in the posterior realm, because everyone does everything forward. You're carrying your groceries here, you're grabbing your kids, you're bench pressing, you're pushing. Everything tends to be here. You're on your phones, you're sitting. So what do? We got to open up everything. So this is honestly one of my favorites. I don't even really have a name for this. We're just going to call it the Posterior Superman. And all I need is some type of PVC. A barbell would actually be too heavy at the beginning. A lot of times I'll start people with a PVC, and then as they progress, I might slide like a 5-pound weight over the top of it. And you'll see why here in 1 second. So the first thing we're going to do is we're going to grab the PVC over our backs while laying flat. I want a palm down position, not a palm up. Now, as I get more flexibility, I'll be able to grab narrower. When you first start off, you're going to be wider on the PVC. So find your position here, and how do I know? It's going to be determined by my range of motion, because what we're going to do here is I'm going to pull my shoulders back and down, and then with a straight arm, I'm just going to lift, lift, lift. When I get to my top position, I'm going to hold for a few seconds and then control the weight back down, touch, and then back up. So again, it's going to look like so. I lift, lift, lift. Again, pull the shoulders down, hold, 3, 2, 1, control, touch, back up, lift further, keep pulling, keep pulling, keep pulling. Now I'm going to do about 10 repetitions like this. Now, if I can get my arms straight up, meaning straight up to the ceiling, then I can move my hands in. But notice when I move my hands in, like for me right now, that's as far as I can go. So therefore, that would be too much of a narrow grip. Okay, we want to find that sweet spot. Go as wide as you need to get your arms up to vertical. And then if you don't even have that, we might have to work there. But just from that alone, your ability to reach behind your back. My women, how many people, it's always the unhooking the bra. For guys, if you notice a difference, right? This one's going to start to open up that anterior capsule, But again, we want to get the strength, so we want to lock it down as we pull up into position. This would be our posterior Superman. So a quick summary of this little section we did on mobility. There are a ton of exercises that we can come up with to really work the concepts of mobility. We can get very specific at any joint of the body. However, that's gonna be more in depth. And if you really need to contact me in terms of some of the neuro pieces, or if you need some specific, more types of physical therapy for mobility, again, we can always help out with that. However, understand the concepts. And you're gonna get a lot further in your mobility training if you work on active range of motion as opposed to passive stretching. So if you take away anything from this series, those are just some examples of what you can do at the primary joints. Most people have hip and back tightness and shoulder tightness when it comes to mobility issues. And so if we can start to work on some of the opposites, if we can start pulling in position and we learn how to lengthen muscles actively and reprogram how the muscles actually fire to create that stability, which then creates mobility, you'll be a lot further in your process. Hopefully that helps. This is to longevity now for a healthy, long life of moving your body the way that you were designed.